And finally, a reminder that closed captioning of the webinar is also available through Zoom, and you can find it using the functions at the bottom of the screen. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm Carmen Masson. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UCSF, and the I-STARR project is co-led by Amy Miracle at the Public Health Institute and me. And the team also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore and Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Nina Subraman and Libo Lee, and communications director Diane Schmidt, and also our team's project coordinator Quinoja Pepitini. Next slide, please. So we're also very fortunate to have a wonderful 17-member advisory board. It's comprised of diverse leaders from across the country. Our advisory board members represent recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, and researchers and educators. Next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit about our presenter. Dr. Kevin Wenzel is a clinical psychologist, and he's the director of research at Maryland Treatment Centers based in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Wenzel provides research oversight to study staff and projects. He participates in the design and implementation of clinical trials and other research projects and disseminates results through presentations and other scholarly work. His recent scientific funding includes projects that design and test a multi-component behavioral intervention to improve medication compliance in adolescents and young adults with opioid use disorder, a peer recovery support services intervention to improve medication uptake and adherence for adults with opioid use disorder, and a project to adapt and test written exposure therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder delivered in residential addiction treatment settings. He is funded by research grants from the National Institute of Health. So without further delay, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Wenzel. So let's get started on the topic of peer recovery support services for individuals and recovery residences and MOUD. Next slide, please.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Carmen, and to the whole I-STARR team for having me today. I'm very excited to present to you our project overview, but also some results associated with this R34 funded by NIDA. I'm an MPI on the project, as well as my colleague, Dr. Fishman, who I think was not able to join today, but I do see some others from the team. Feel free to wave or put yourself in the chat. Next slide, please. Here, some of them are. So on the top there, we have some of the peer support specialists who have worked on this project, helping to co-develop the intervention and deliver it. In the middle there, we have some of our sort of boots on the ground coordinators and assistants helping with data collection and participant consent and recruitment. And on the bottom, some of our research scientists working on the project. We're based in Baltimore, but we also have a location out of Rockville, Maryland, where we did a lot of our recruiting. And the organization we work for, Maryland Treatment Centers, is primarily a provider of services for people with addictions and co-occurring mental health disorders. But we have a research division, which is really fun to be integrated right into that setting. So thank you to the whole team for all your help. Couldn't have done it without you guys. Next slide, please. Here's what I hope to accomplish today. Understand the key variables in this research. Everybody's at a little bit of a different level coming in today, so I'll do a quick overview of some of those variables and talk about the significant and clinical significance of this research, why we're doing it, why we think it's important, and also to go over the results from our trial and talk about what we think this all means for the future of our field. Next slide, please. Keep going. There we go. Okay. So the first sort of variable of under consideration are medications for opioid use disorder, or MOUD. Perhaps this is the most concrete variable in our study. So we have the 3 FDA-approved medicines for opioid use disorder: methadone, buprenorphine, and extended release naltrexone, and buprenorphine comes in both daily sublingual forms like Suboxone, but also extended release monthly injectables. These medicines are considered the gold standard treatment for opioid use disorder. And, there's a ton of research on how to support people getting access, staying on these medicines, and improving their efficacy, just like the goals of I-STARR. Next slide. Peer recovery support services is also an important variable to define today. And there's, it's still a developing field, I think, in terms of defining these constructs of peer workers or recovery coaches. Here are just two definitions I stole from the SAMHSA website and the Recovery Research Institute website. But essentially, peers are people with lived experience in particular experiences related to behavioral health, and they're people who are trying to help others based on their lessons learned. And they can be employed or not and work in various settings and can be plugged into the whole sort of spectrum of opioid use disorder services from identification all the way to long-term recovery. Next slide. And then recovery residents or recovery residents are also have some heterogeneity in how people think about them or define them. Here are a couple of examples, but essentially they involve some sort of recovery aspect, some sort of wishing to have substances and addictions less problematic in that person's life, and they involve they involve a residential component. And so you can see here on the slide, non-medical settings designed to support recovery, alcohol and drug-free living environments that provide peer support for those wanting to initiate and sustain recovery. Recovery residences provide safe and healthy community-oriented home environments. So you get the idea, but I'll talk a little bit more later about how we define these coming into play with our particular project. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the problem that we're trying to address here? Essentially, we have these FDA-approved medications for opioid use disorder that have very high effect sizes in terms of our medicines that we have for addiction and substance use disorders in general. These are the heavy hitters. These are the ones that consistently prevent death by overdose, fatal overdose, and non-fatal overdose, and relapse to opioid use, and improve all sorts of other recovery indicators. And so that's terrific that we have this technology, but they're underutilized for multiple reasons. And one of the ways to increase their utilization is to develop methods to improve retention. So even if somebody does start on an MOUD and they decide that that's the right choice for them, they, on average, don't stay on it long enough to really accrue the therapeutic benefits of the medication itself. And people stop using medicines for many reasons, but it would be nice to have some strategies to increase retention on average. So, two recovery support services, recovery residences, and peer support services that we just talked about are traditionally separated from treatment, where medicines would be utilized and promoted and accessible. But we thought that there was some synergy there, and potentially these recovery support services could be leveraged to improve treatment outcomes. And so in the current environment where the integration between treatment services and recovery support services is evolving, we wanted to see how that could work for MOUD retention. Next slide, please. The crux of our research question comes down to this: can peers help people in recovery residences stay on MOUD? And so we designed a clinical trial to try to answer that question in a pilot sort of way. Next slide. The three aims of our R34 project are displayed on the screen. The first one had to do with developing this intervention and taking existing peer support practices and adapting them and expanding them to talk about MOUD a little more specifically and as a target behavior. And we were able to develop that and pilot that with the help of our peer support specialists on the project. I could do a whole presentation on that, but today we're going to be focused on aim 2, which was to conduct a pilot randomized controlled trial to test the preliminary efficacy of this peer support intervention. Our primary outcome that we were interested in was medication retention. So regardless of the type of medication, whatever the person had selected and started on, our goal was to help them stay on that and overcome barriers to retention. We had a 6-month intervention period. Next slide, please. One caveat to this presentation is our original plan versus the reality that we came up upon. So our original plan was to target recovery residences that were more lower on the NAR level, which meant more like a peer-run recovery residence like an Oxford House or a similar setting. NAR is the National, I think it's Association for Recovery Residences, and they have defined different levels of recovery residences. And then recently, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, or ASAM, came out with some guidance and definitions on residential treatment and how there's some overlap between a level 4 NAR residence where clinical services are included at the house, at the residence, and in ASAM jargon, a 3.1 level of care, which is a low intensity residential of about 4 hours of clinical services per week, where people are living in a residential treatment setting. So the difficulties with planning versus reality were that we were intending on collaborating with peer-run recovery residences. We bit off more than we could chew, and it was difficult for us to really establish a robust network of recovery residences to partner with to conduct this research. And so we pivoted and we expanded our recruitment to people who are living at ASAM level 3.1 treatment centers. Some of those treatment centers kind of looked and smelled like a recovery residence that was a level 4. Some of them were more of a medical setting. And so it might be a thing where all level 4s could be 3.1s, but not all 3.1s are really recovery houses type of mentality. So to conduct the trial and to test the peer intervention, this is the sort of sacrifice we made methodologically. So we can keep that in mind as we're interpreting the results. All right, next slide, please. Okay, our methods. So just to give you an idea, our participants were English-speaking adults with opioid use disorder who were newly residing at a recovery residence or a 3.1 program. So they were newly enrolled, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks, where we tried to catch them at the beginning of their stay. And they were also all on MOUD at the time of recruitment. They were randomized evenly to either treatment as usual alone or treatment as usual plus the peer intervention for 24 weeks. The PRSS intervention, again, I could spend a lot of time describing it, but for the sake of today, I'll give you a short description, which is essentially all the usual peer things outlined by SAMHSA in terms of connecting people to recovery resources in the community, providing recovery coaching and recovery management checkups, in addition to this new kind of expanded role where there was a focus on MOUD adherence. And this started with the peer leading a discussion about the person's knowledge and attitudes of medication for opioid use disorder as a part of an initial wellness plan. And we really saw people all over the map. Sometimes this was somebody's first time on a medicine, sometimes they had been all of that on all of them and knew a lot of the details. Some people were reluctant to be on MOUD, but were giving it a try. Other people's, knew that this was the correct recovery pathway for them as a main component of their recipe of recovery for them. So the peers tried to meet people where they were at, and then at the forefront address MOUD adherence. And whatever the person said their plan was, the peer's job was to try to help them stick to the plan, or if it needed to be modified, to help them through that. Treatment as usual, just a quick note, was whatever they were doing at baseline. And so they were all in this recovery residence or 3.1 program. They were all in MOUD, but some of them might have been in an IOP. Some of them might have had other counseling involved. We did not control for that. So whatever they were doing at baseline, and hoped that it all washed out in the randomization. Next slide, please. Here are the major measures and outcomes we were interested in collecting for data. So we created a demographics questionnaire which assessed general information about the sample as well as their OUD history. We used the timeline follow back, which is a calendar-based method of assessing usually substance use. But in this case, we also used it to assess medication adherence. So daily, looking at did you take the medicine, yes or no? And if they were on an injectable, since they only take that once every 28 days, they got like an automatic 28 days, yes, I was adherent. Whereas the daily medicines were assessed by a self-report per day. Opioid use was also assessed by the timeline follow back. And then we had a recovery capital measure, the BARC, and substance use disorder severity was assessed by the substance problem scale, which maps onto the DSM criteria to see how the use is, what sort of negative consequences that the use is causing in the person's life. Next slide, please. Drum roll results. So here are some sample characteristics. Our sample was mostly in their 30s, mean age of 38, mostly male. Not surprising. This is very similar to what we see like at our inpatient treatment center in terms of demographics. Most of the participants were in an ASAM level 3.1 program. The other 15% were in a recovery residence that was not part of a treatment program. 85% of the sample had at least a high school diploma or GED. Next slide, please. And here's some information on the opioid use severity at baseline. The mean age at first opioid use was 20 years, so consistent what we know about OUD is it often starts in adolescence or young adulthood and progresses. The preferred route of administration in about half the people was injection, and about half the people had ever injected. The average number of overdoses was 5 prior to being enrolled in the study. Everybody met criteria for severe opioid use disorder. So it's a pretty severe sample overall. And then in terms of the medication choices that people were on, about a quarter on methadone, 40% on sublingual daily buprenorphine like Suboxone, Zubsolv. And then a third were on extended release buprenorphine, the injectable like Brixadi and Sublocade. And 7% were on Vivitrol, which is extended release naltrexone. Next slide, please. Okay, our primary outcome related to medication adherence are listed here, and we measured it in different ways. This table shows in 4 columns the variable we're interested in measuring, the mean or frequency for the PRSS group, the mean or frequency for the treatment as usual or our control group, and then the final column is whether or not the difference between the two groups was statistically significant. And NS stands for non-significant. So spoiler alert, in all our outcomes, we saw no significant differences, but let's look at them a little bit closer. So the proportion of days on medication for opioid use disorder was virtually identical in the two groups. About 80% of the days, people were reporting via self-report that they were adhering to their medicine. Likewise, the mean total days throughout the 6 months intervention was 133 versus 138 days. So it's very close between the two groups, not significantly different. We also wondered, what about the outcome of continuous MOUD throughout without a break, a clinically significant break, where somebody stepped away from treatment and for some time. No significant differences in that. We looked at what about people who had dropped out but then got reinitiated, like maybe the peers were helping people get plugged back in after a dropout. We didn't see any significant difference there. And then, and of course, in that one, we could only examine the people who had dropped out as our subsample. So that was a pretty small group. And then we also looked at, regardless of what happened during the 24 weeks, what about just at the 24-week mark? Were people still on the MOUD, yes or no? And that also came out as non-significantly different. And most people are still on MOUD. Next slide, please. Our secondary outcomes related to other important measures. Were they using opioids? And what about related constructs like their substance use problems, like the negative consequences, and their recovery capital scores? This table is set up in the same way. You can see the values there were all non-significantly different between the two groups. 25 versus 15 relapse on opioids. The average number of days of opioid use in the 6 months was 6.5 versus 5.5, pretty much the same. The substance problem scores and the BARC scores were also virtually identical from baseline to, sorry, these are not baseline default. This is between the two groups at week 24. Next slide, please. All right, so what do we make of all that? First, the good news. In our sample, individuals with OUD who got initiated onto medicine and made it to this recovery residence or 3.1 program do pretty well. This was very encouraging to see because of a lot of our research is with, I guess, a higher acuity population or folks who are just prognostically not as set up well. So we saw in this group 80% adherence, 80% of the days, which happens to be a gold standard in general medicine, let alone severe OUD, where people can be disorganized and have all sorts of other problems. So if somebody can overcome the challenges related to acute detoxification withdrawal management, receive a referral to continuing care, initiate medicine, actually get to the recovery residence, and still sign up for our study, the idea was they had already overcome these amazing barriers. And so they were all set up to do pretty well. So we were really pleased to see the 80% adherence. Most had 0 days of opioid use. So that was the MOUD. The average was 5 to 6 days. Only 1 in 5 had a clinically significant relapse during the 6 months. We define that as 10 or more days of use during a 1-month period. And so the bottom line here is usual care, including recovery residences and 3.1s, can work really well for those who engage in it. And that was encouraging to see, including people on MOUD. Next slide. The less good news relates to those non-significant differences. We were hoping to see that the PRSS intervention could improve outcomes compared to treatment as usual. We didn't find that, and our speculations are on this slide. So 80% medication adherence, that's already the gold standard. So we're probably bumping up against a ceiling effect. It's hard to improve outcomes above 80%, even if you threw a bunch of stuff at people, because people decide they don't want to take the medicine anymore, or they've fallen out of contact, or life happens. Days of opioid use was likewise very positive in both groups. Only 5 or 6 days of opioid use out of 6 months, whereas before they had initiated this treatment episode, most were daily users or frequent users. So we might be coming up against a floor effect there. The idea is saying that you can't get better than 0. And so as both groups approach non-use or approach abstinence, you can't do better than that from a statistical perspective. And then the other indicators of success were the substance use problem scale and the recovery capital. Both of those were good, and both of those were pretty much equivalent by week 24. And our guess here is that the folks in our trial were pretty saturated in terms of treatment and recovery support. And adding on the peer was maybe adding, let's say they already have 4 or 5 big supports. They already have medicine, they already have a place to live, they already have a treatment provider, maybe they have some peers in the house that are supportive. And so adding on one additional, you can't get that much variance more out of that. So we suspect that maybe these didn't separate because there was already a saturation of resources and support in either condition, didn't matter. All right, so next slide, please. Where do we go from here? What conclusions do we draw? What is our next research question out of this? So we're always excited about that, and good research, I think, always brings up at least as many questions as you had to begin with. So the first bullet point is intended to be provocative. PRSS doesn't work for MOUD adherence? Probably not. The people in the study reported anecdotally that this was really helpful, and we have some other indicators of acceptability that we haven't presented here, but I think this is still very worthy of investigation, and more likely there wasn't enough room for improvement in this sample, probably because of our methodological design. So the third bullet point is something we're already working on. It asks the question, could this type of peer intervention be more impactful in a different setting, especially in a different setting where they don't have as many recovery supports? And having a peer with lived experience and MOUD knowledge and skill to guide them in those decisions would be something they wouldn't have access to otherwise. So we think that a potential different setting that would be very useful to explore is the transition from that withdrawal management to wherever they go next. Could be a recovery residence, could be long-term, could be IOP. But that transition is fraught with problems, that linkage. And the nice thing about this intervention is it could stand alone from a specific treatment center or a specific recovery residence to stick with the person for a prolonged amount of time to wherever they end up and navigate those types of challenges. So we are so excited to have started with our R34. We added an additional aim, additional scope to do a single-armed trial, no randomization, but starting this in the acute inpatient residential setting, even before they get on MOUD, even when that conversation is still happening and evolving. And we are 29 subjects recruited as of like last week. So we're hoping that that lays the groundwork to modify the intervention in terms of the conversations that the peers would need to have, and also the setting in which it occurs. So to lay the groundwork for a future study. The other thing that I think is an outstanding question and something we struggled to answer of this original idea of peer recovery support services in sort of actual recovery residences, more traditional, standalone, separate from treatment environments, which might have less support in general and or less support specifically for medications for opioid use disorder. We feel like we weren't able to adequately test that question. And I think the applicability of peer recovery support services in that setting is still worthy of being investigated if somebody can pull off getting the network of recovery residents to find participants. Um, so I think in those settings where there's just fewer resources, this could really help. And you guys probably know, but I-STARR has put together all sorts of webinars to help researchers connect to recovery residences and vice versa. And before these types of infrastructure building grants, there was very little out there. It was calling up Amy and asking for help. So I think continued need for those learning collaboratives and resources is so important to answer these questions. I think that is my last slide. So I would love to hear from, yeah, I'll turn it over to
Thank you so much, Dr. Wenzel. That was an amazing presentation. So at this point, we can open up the discussion for members here who can put their questions into the chat, or who can raise your virtual hand and ask a question. I see already a question. Amy, you had your hand raised, or was it?
That was actually just clapping for Kevin because he did such a
Okay.
fantastic job. Amazing pacing. I love that we have so much time for questions. I did want to highlight that Sarah Sadek dropped something into the chat about a UT health study that's going on. Sarah, do you want to unmute yourself and say something about that?
Sure. So I'm with the House of Extra Measures, and we have 2 men's and 2 women's houses, and we're actually we have a grant through HHSC with UT Health, where we take in anyone who has OUD and is on some type of MOUD. And the study is actually, so one of the men's houses and one of the women's houses is assigned a recovery coach to see if that helps with, long-term effects of MOUD and the residents in long-term recovery. And then the other one doesn't have a assigned recovery coach. So that's part of the data that they're collecting right now, along with, a ton of other things. But we've actually started working with them in 2021, and it's still going on. So we just got refunded for another 5 years. And it's fully funded housing. So as long as they have OUD and are taking some type of MOUD, that can be Vivitrol, naltrexone, Suboxone, methadone, anything like that. And while they're in the house, they can also, decide to get off of it in the long run and still have their housing secured. Usually our residents don't stay longer than 6 months to a year, sometimes a little bit longer, because we are level 3 housing, so they will move down eventually. But, I mean, personally, I'm on MOUD and I have been for 4.5 years. And so, it's helped me in my recovery. This is my first time in recovery, and I've been in recovery since my clean date in 2021. So, You know, I think that it's made a huge difference, having just the support of other people who are on MOUD within the house as well, you know, and not the stigma of people who aren't on it in the same house with them, you know, because there's still tons of stigma around MOUD. And then the other side of that is, you know, the only thing that, you know, some people think methadone is better than Suboxone, that's better than naltrexone. We'll have those little issues, you know, but once people realize that we're all suffering from addiction and OUD and we're all trying to recover, you know, that usually gets wiped away pretty quickly, the stigma and things like that. But it's nice to have that available to people who have OUD and who want to use MOUD. You know, it's better for them to take MOUD than them to die. You know, that's the alternative, to go out and use something else. You know, it's a prescribed medication. As long as you're taking it as prescribed, then it works effectively. You know, and I wish more people understood MOUD and the how effective it is for people who take it, you know, under doctor's orders, and how beneficial it is to those who are recovering from opioid use disorder. So
Thank you so much for those comments. I think you said it great, and a couple of things I would highlight is, one is the way you're partnering with UT to assign a coach to a house directly might be a more feasible methodology than the one I used, which was to try to get a bunch of different houses and randomize at the individual level. But you could actually like randomize or sort of study that at the house level, even if
right.
your role was the same. So that's a really cool study you're working on. That's great. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight of what you mentioned is the stigma, and the stigma of MOUD and the availability of MOUD and the availability of recovery residences
Yeah.
and 3.1 programs varies tremendously in this country by geographic reason. And
hmm
so I think one sort of limitation to the work we've done is it's all in central Maryland, where we are Medicaid expansion state. So people favor going to 3.1 programs because Medicaid will cover it instead of having to pay for a recovery residence where you usually pay rent. Uh,
Right.
and everybody can get MOUD, and it's definitely shifted in the culture here over the last 5-10 years to be significantly reduced stigma.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you for your presentation.
My pleasure.
Hey, Amy, you have your hand raised this time? Okay.
This is actually my hand. So, Kevin, I'm very interested in how you were able to identify recovery residences and match the recovery residences in the ASAM 3.1s. What is your sense of how well they matched up? How were they different, if they were different? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's an area I want to learn more about. Even at the time when we expanded the inclusion criteria, it was still, here's what NAR says, here's what ASAM says, and at least from what I could find online and talking to people, there wasn't a lot of cross talk and trying to talk about how these definitions and operationalizations could be integrated. And then I found updated guidance when I was preparing for this presentation, which actually explicitly addresses that question. And I think it's still under development. But one thing that would be interesting to do is to, even on the back end of our project, catalog where people were in our study and then learn about that setting. Because all I know is, oh, they were at XYZ place. But what did it look like? What did it feel like? How was it the same or different? What was their subjective experience more like a home? Or was it more like a residential treatment center? And I think that probably plays a role in all of this. But
And just a quick follow-up question. You're limited a little bit by sample size, but I'm guessing that you did subgroup analyses to see if there were some people who might have benefited differentially from the intervention, or if the setting was a factor in it.
we
Did
did.
anything like that pan out?
None of it panned out. We are limited by sample size, but there was no apparent differences in medication adherence, whether they were in a recovery residence or in a 3.1.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Good. Kevin, I think this is an excellent study, and I agree with you. I think there's still an opportunity to look at how well peer recovery support services work in that kind of level one setting. You know, that said, I think there's more opportunity for you to go back and do some qualitative work, as you mentioned, to learn a little bit more about the settings and what was being provided there. I also think that the outcome measure of adherence can be a little bit challenging when you have methadone, extended release naltrexone, extended release buprenorphine and buprenorphine. And so I just wondered, you know, for people who are taking it sublingual buprenorphine or dosing daily, whether, you know, that kind of the peer support may make a difference. So just looking at a more homogeneous sample, you know, I'm just thinking about what the potential limitations are to this work, and that there's still more that can be done, you know, with this question, because I don't think it has, like you said, been fully answered with the small sample.
Yeah, definitely. It would be very interesting to know those group differences. And interestingly, we looked just to see, you know, were there differences in adherence rates by what medication they were on. And we were shocked to find that the people who struggled most were those on extended release buprenorphine, the injectable bupe, because that's very, very counter to our clinical experience. And it's not very intuitive, but I think it's a sample size issue,
Yeah.
For the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And we also had, you know, one of the reasons we chose MOUD adherence, regardless of medication type, for our outcome is because it's not uncommon for people to switch and decide this one isn't working, I want to go to a different one, or I'm having XYZ side effect. And thank goodness we have options. But you're right, in terms of methodological purity, you wonder, is there some noise in there?
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask about racial ethnic composition, because African Americans are less likely to be prescribed buprenorphine. And you said that it's in Maryland, right? So I'm not
In Maryland, yeah.
as familiar with Maryland racial ethnic composition of people there, but I didn't see it on your slide. Did you report that? I thought it was mostly male, mostly young, 38.
38, yeah. I think you're right. I think I didn't put that in that slide.
Probably, I would say mostly white, you know, because people of color have a much more difficult time getting these medications, in particular buprenorphine. It's more expensive, you know, and so on.
Yes, certainly at a
Insurance.
national level, we see those barriers, absolutely. I see my colleague Jennifer Carano on Dr. Carano did some of the analyses. Do you remember? Did we?
No, but if you give me a second, I can pull it up. I'm in the process right now.
If you get to it, that's great, but happy to take other questions.
I can always throw it in the chat too if
That'd
we
be
move
great.
on.
And the other point was kind of looking at the impact of having those recovery coaches longer than that kind of 6-month intervention, because that's pretty brief, right? Or, you know, you're not looking at the longer term outcomes as well
Yes.
in this pilot trial.
Yeah. And it was enough time for some people to have some stops and starts or to change the setting where they were in. But certainly, I think the whole field is limited by our longitudinal outcomes. addiction recovery science and addiction medicine, we don't go out that far in terms of the way we know that substance use disorder can be a chronic illness. So I agree, that would be a way to improve and look in the future to see if there's more separation.
But, you know, kudos to this study, 80% adherence rate. That's really very, very good. I mean, that's like, wow. It's
It
amazing.
really was a breath of fresh air to see people doing so well. Many of our other studies recruit people right out of withdrawal management detox episodes as a point of starting a study or starting tracking. And at that time, there's 3 or 4 more big hoops to jump through that made our sample a little different. Yeah.
Well, I think that brings up a really good point. And I love that you mentioned that you're kind of doing this secondary study to support some of your findings, that if you catch people earlier, those are the people who might need, because you've demonstrated that if you get to the recovery housing, if you get to the 3.1, you're going to be okay. But there's a lot of drop off in between, you know, when you're doing your initial detox and getting there.
Absolutely. And we you know, part of our setting is at a residential substance use treatment center, and the counselors are often frustrated by putting together a discharge plan, collaborating with the patient, and then you call the recovery residents, you know, did so and so make it? I know they discharged. It's like, no, I haven't heard from them. And so those types of settings, that could be the exact next step. So we're hoping, we're definitely very enthusiastic about this line of research.
That's
Any
some
other-
nice numbers for you if you want them really quickly.
Yeah,
Oh.
tell us.
All right, so it was about 66% white, 31% black, and then the rest was other.
Okay.
Nice. Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, if not, and Amy, you don't see anything in the chat, correct?
No.
So that was a really wonderful discussion. And so I want to give you a heads up about some things that are coming up in the next couple of months. So Kunoja, next slide, please. So what we're doing next month is we're featuring Dr. Bettina Heppner, who will be presenting on the intersection of recovery community centers and recovery housing. In November, we'll hear from Aaron Williams, who is also one of the members of our advisory committee, and he is advisory board member from the National Council for Mental Wellbeing, and he will be presenting on new horizons and opportunities for recovery housing. So unless otherwise advertised, the I-STARR webinars are held on the 3rd Tuesday of the month from 11 to 12 for those on the West Coast and from 2 to 3 for those on the East Coast. And you can register for any or all of the webinars we have scheduled on the I-STARR website. And you can also stay connected with the I-STARR project through social media accounts, which are listed on this slide. So while you're on the website, you may also see information about the I-STARR training series. And the training series consists of 12 webinars with separate training topics for recovery housing operators or providers, as well as those interested in conducting research on recovery residences. Those who participate in all 12 webinars in the training series will receive a certificate of completion and will be provided an option for being identified on the I-STARR website as someone who completed the training. So at this point, because it's a live training series and that part has ended, we can only track completion of the webinars if you register for the series and view the webinars on the I-STARR learning management system of the website. If you have any questions about the training series or about how to complete it, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Next slide, please. So we're running out of time, and I want to extend my sincere thank yous to Dr. Wenzel for an amazing webinar today and everyone in attendance and for your time and attention. And we hope to see everyone here again on Tuesday, October 21st for the next presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the intervening month. Again, thank you, Dr. Wenzel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.